Hi everyone, my name's Darryl Panes, CEO of As Good as Gold Australia. And this evening, once again, I'm joined by my brother Brian, Darryl As Good as Gold. And tonight we interview Alasdair Macleod, Head of Research at GoldMoney. Good evening, Alasdair.
Good evening to you both.
Look, Alasdair, I have been thinking about this all day long. I'm looking at the world at the moment, I am thinking to myself, how could you describe the world right now? I mean, the state that it's in. How could you describe it? And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking unprecedented debt, out of control inflation. I mean, we're just being told lies on inflation all of the time. Two wars dominating, global media channels. The world's bankrupt in reality.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I can think of a lot of ways of describing it, but chaos has got to be right up front, right?
Yeah.
And I think to myself, in amongst all of this chaos, there's an interesting thought. Non-Western central banks at the moment are buying enormous amounts of gold. 1,200, 1,300 tonnes annually. The worldwide mining production of gold's around 3,200. They're buying a really big chunk, right? And the question I want to ask Alasdair is, what are they seeing that the Western banks are not seeing?
I think fear of a collapse of the Western system. The interesting one, I think, in all this is Singapore, who have been building their gold reserves, very significantly. For a small island state, it's quite remarkable how much gold they have been buying. The one thing I would say about the Singaporeans is that they really do have their finger on the Asian pulse. They really do have, they understand the geopolitical situation. They understand, as a small island, they have to be very careful about how they protect themselves from us larger guys who, might bully them around. And they haven't really sort of sided with anyone. But the fact that they've been accumulating such large quantities of gold, I think is a very clear indication that they see what China is doing, they see what Russia is doing, and they see what America and the G7 are doing. And they can see, the dangers, if you like, in the two sort of opposite poles of monetary approach. And anyone with half a brain looking at what's going on with the dollar and America's finances, Japan's finances, I'm talking government finances, the whole thing is actually set up for a complete collapse of the fiat currency system. And, so what do you do if you're China and Russia and all the rest of it trying to build commercial power worldwide? Well, the answer is you've got to protect yourself from the follies of the West. And I think that's basically what's happening. And I would also add that, the figures that we get for, the sort of gold reserves, the increase in gold reserves are only part of the story, because a lot of these nations are also secretly accumulating gold and not marking them as central bank reserves. Wow. They're putting them into things like sovereign wealth funds, for example, or secret funds. The Chinese have used various accounts, and we know that. Anecdotal evidence. I have a great friend who used to visit China a lot. He knew a lot of the businessmen in China, and he told me of one of his Japanese business friends who had substantial manufacturing capability in China. He was friends with senior staff officers, generals, and so on and so forth in the People's Liberation Army. And after meeting one of them, this guy said, well, come on, let me just show you something. And he had a warehouse actually stacked with gold bars. That was the story that came back. Now, look, this is not me. There may be some exaggeration in the telling, but it confirms what I do know, and that is that way back in 1983, having been appointed to do so, the People's Bank of China began accumulating gold secretly. Now, remember that 1983, we had a bear market in gold, which took it from, I think the 1983 values were around about $400 or $500 an ounce, eventually down to about half that, with the West basically selling out of gold completely. The Chinese government, through the People's Bank, which also incidentally had the monopoly on currency dealing in China, so it could switch, play ducks and drakes between dollars and gold, whatever. I mean, the setup was absolutely clear, and consequently, I concluded that before the general public were allowed to buy gold, remember that the general public were banned from gold ownership until 2002. But at that stage, suddenly the state turns around and says, right, the people can now buy gold. We'll set up the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which will be owned and run by the People's Bank as part of its legal mandate, which we gave them in articles, whatever, in 1983. Furthermore, we will advertise that people should buy gold. And on top of that, no gold was allowed to leave China. Now, by 2002, I reckoned that China would probably have accumulated somewhere between 20 and 25,000 tons of gold secretly for the state. In other words, people were then allowed to buy gold once the state had got its basic position. Now, it has obviously increased from then. Now, when you look at, for example, the People's Bank of China has been declaring, constantly larger gold reserves. I mean, these figures don't really matter. We don't know whether the People's Bank has been in the market actually sort of accumulating gold, because remember, they're the biggest miners on earth now, which is another aspect, why should they invest so heavily in gold mine output when, gold is a pet rock? It doesn't matter, but the fact is they did. And I do remember talking to a director of one of the large Swiss refiners back in 2014. And I asked him, do you ever see any Chinese refined 1 kilo bars? And he said, no. I asked him the same question about 4 or 5 years later. He's retired now. And he said, well, we have seen just a few, but we think they were smuggled out. Basically, gold, it's Hotel California for gold. You just, it doesn't leave. A little bit actually goes from China into Hong Kong, but that is regulated on the basis that it satisfies jewelry demand, because there is a sales tax on jewelry in China. But if you're Chinese and you wander into Hong Kong on a shopping spree, there is no sales tax there, and you can accumulate your gold there. Now, the authorities turn a blind eye to this by allowing a little bit of gold to go into Hong Kong, so that these tourists, shoppers can actually deal tax-free. And they advertised on television. And then earlier this year, in about June, they actually turned around and instructed the state-owned banks or state-controlled banks to offer gold ownership facilities to their deposit holders. In other words, and this is not intended to be an unallocated account. It was intended to be an allocated account. In other words, gold ownership is being spread from the jewelry market as the principal means of acquiring gold, 24-karat gold, to a wider Chinese audience. The poor people, as long as you've got a bank account, you can have very small savings, and you can take it out of deposits and put it into gold. Why are they doing this? Why are they, why is it that all the way back from about 2008, when they first started advertising, buy gold, it does you good or something, whatever it was. Why are they doing it? Well, there is only one answer, and that is something that every economist in China was taught at sort of Marxist economics schools, and that is that eventually the Western capitalist system will collapse with its currencies. You know, so coming from a completely different economic discipline, they see the reality of this, and they're now in a position where they need to protect themselves from our follies. The fact that we have completely detached for a long period of time our currencies from true money, and the fact that the problems, now that we've got rising interest rates, are escalating at a really frightening pace. So that's roughly where we are. And of course, there's stories within the story, which, you know, we may or may not discuss. But anyway, it's up to you to ask the questions.
One thing that sort of confuses me a little bit is, you know, obviously, or I don't know, is it obvious that the Western central banks don't read history books? Because, you know, if you look back to 1918, there is a clear example there, just after World War One. But America really takes over the mantle from Great Britain. But they got paid for goods and services to Great Britain during World War One in gold.
Yeah.
They wouldn't take the British pound, they took gold. So it emphasises how valuable they thought gold was at that point, how much of a priority it was, and yet now it's being treated very casually. It seems really strange.
So that is, as far as monetary policy committees are concerned, economic history started in 1936 with Keynes's general theory. I mean, anything before that was just not valid. Right. It was the creation. I mean, it was that book that led to the creation of macroeconomics. And I must say, when I hear people saying, "Well, I follow the macro," and I sort of think, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You really do." That is the start of economic history, really. Though you and I, or three of us, know that that's just a complete fallacy.
Fallacy.
And the whole thing has been reinforced by America's irresponsible approach to the dollar, going all the way back to 1933, when they stopped American people from owning gold or owning notes which were convertible into gold. And they were all meant to be submitted to be redeemed. Then subsequently, there was the devaluation by about 40% when they raised the price from $20.67 to $35. And then gradually over the years, after the Bretton Woods was formed, I mean, basically, you look at the gold reserves in America, and they just declined and declined and declined until it got to the stage where there was a crisis. And the crisis we saw, it became very public when Nixon turned around and said he was suspending the Bretton Woods Agreement. Why? Because basically they hadn't any gold to offer up. Now, I know there was 8,000 tons or something, but was that gold, which was actually LBMA compliant, as we would call it now? Or was it sort of, if you like, coin quality gold? Like in American coin quality gold was 90% gold, 10% other metal. So, that's not good enough for, let's say the Bank of France or the Bundesbank, if you like, saying, we want to redeem dollars for gold. In other words, they'd actually got to the bottom of the barrel. They then started a propaganda program once they gave it up, trying to persuade us that gold was a pet rock. It was history. It had nothing to do with today. We now live in modern times. Gold is the dollar is the new money. And what a load of rubbish. It's just propaganda. It just goes completely against the history of money. It goes completely against the legal status of money as opposed to credit. And they've kidded us all. I mean, I've even known Austrian economists sort of believe that the dollar is money.
Okay.
Come on. Send them back to school. They should know better.
Yes, as Darryl said, obviously there's so many government people and politicians that just don't read history. And you've taught us the fact that debt destroys nations. It always does, and always has done and throughout history. The governments come through with a policy of taking the gold down to copper content, so there's 1% gold there. So the debt goes up and it destroys the nations because they got no confidence. The people have no confidence in it. They work out that their gold coin is only 1% gold, 99% copper. Yeah. So, Alasdair, you did an interview about a week and a half ago with Derek King, and I was so impressed with that this particular interview now, we're going to cover a couple of questions that are points of interest that I heard of that, and I'll run through these. But although I don't think too many Australians would have heard that audio with King, with Derek King. But here we go, at least. And if your answers are adapted to the same, I hope they are, because it's all based on fact, right? So the question I have is that the United States, Europe, and especially Japan are all in a massive debt trap. Could the bank in Japan be the first to fall over, and what would that do to the price of gold?
Well, obviously in yen, it would try. I mean, the purchasing power of the yen would actually fall very, very substantially, I think, under those circumstances. The problem that the Japanese have is that their debt to GDP, I'm talking about government debt to GDP, is in the order of about 260%.
Wow.
So this rise in interest rates is actually hurting them. And this is why, I'm sure one reason why the Bank of Japan is sitting as firmly as it can on the interest rate, on interest rates, trying to prevent them from rising from current levels. And they've still got negative short-term interest rates. I mean, they've just shut their eyes to the whole problem. Quite a lot of the inflation in terms of prices in Japan is actually controlled by government subsidies. So, I think inflation's running at something like 4%, something like that, which they're ignoring. But without the government subsidies, it would probably be somewhat higher. No, they've got a real crisis on their hands, as indeed has the mighty dollar, because the debt to GDP in America, we're now looking at over 120%, 126%, something like that, depending on your view of GDP. And the problem they have is that the interest cost is just rocketing. I mean, in the last fiscal year, which ended in September, the debt interest bill was around, I think it was something like $980 billion. I mean, that's the thick end of $1 trillion. Back in May, it was estimated by the Congressional Budget Office that this bill would be actually in the region of something like, I think, 48% lower. I mean, it was considerably lower, that's for sure. So the question is, what's the bill going to be in the current fiscal year, which runs from October the 1st into 2024? An election year as well, by the way. And I conclude that it could be as much as $1.5 trillion out of what I would expect to be a total budget deficit in somewhere between about 3.5, maybe as high as $4 trillion. I mean, This is the problem, because not only have you got the debt interest rising, but there is no doubt that the US economy is in recession. Now, the only thing that says it's not in recession are the unemployment figures, but the unemployment figures are all made up. I mean, they're complete nonsense. I mean, believe you me, I know this is not just me speaking. They have no grounding in reality whatsoever. Wow. These are survey estimates by chosen people by the state. So, you ignore that. But you can see all around the country, there are small businesses, medium-sized businesses getting into trouble, reducing their output. They're trying to control their costs. The banks are not lending. You look at bank credit, that is contracting. Add in what's been happening in the reverse repo market, which, if it hadn't existed, would be recorded as bank credit. So add that back, and it looks to me like M2 has collapsed in effect by around about 9.5% from the high. I mean, this is serious. We've never seen this sort of credit contraction without it being corrected by the central bank, if you like, taking the running and providing the extra credit. So, the Americas really, I mean, when it comes to government spending, what it means is that, the sort of any estimates of tax revenue are way too high. Any estimates of welfare costs are way too low. So that's going to open the gap well above the 1 trillion net of expense in the last fiscal year. And I think we're easily looking at something which could, with the interest bill, look at about, over $3 trillion, $3.5 trillion. And they can't get off it. They really can't get off it. And now, of course, they've got the war in Afghanistan, and they've got a new trouble in the Middle East. You can't fight 2 wars. They can't even fight 1 war. They can't even finance 1 war, let alone 2. So, I mean, whether it's Japan goes first or the dollar goes first, well, I mean, we will see. But I would suggest that King Dollar is actually the thing that really matters. And I think that this winter we will see energy prices continuing to rise. You get a seasonal rise in food prices. And I suspect that the current dip in interest rates and all the propaganda about how interest rates are now topped and we can now look towards lower interest rates, that's propaganda by governments. It's scared out of its wits about what's going on. It sees that the threat to the whole economy is this level of interest rates. So they're trying to back off it. They're trying to persuade us that the problem has gone away. It has not gone away. It's going to come and bite us very, very hard. And we will know that in the not too distant future. I mean, so I think that, I mean, the dollar is the real problem. And another aspect of this is that with the way in which the 10-year US Treasury yield has risen, this has not yet been reflected in a fall in the valuation for the equity markets. I reckon that the S&P 500 is so overvalued that in order to correct itself for the current level of yields in the US Treasury market, it should fall to under 1,000. Now that's a real bear market. So you can see that a further rise in interest rates, which is almost certain given the energy price situation which is evolving, plus the fact that banks are no longer expanding credit, but if anything are trying to contract credit, which drives up the cost of credit to a borrower. This, to my mind, is likely to destabilize the whole of the fiat currency system, which is based on the dollar. And it will start with the dollar and go elsewhere. If it happens with Japan, I don't think that will destabilize the whole situation. But my goodness, it will certainly get us very scared.
I've heard you say before, Alasdair, that, and I'd like to bring this point up with our clients, is that, we've got central banks who supposedly control the money supply, but you said, no, they don't. But I'll come back to that point. But central banks may lower interest rates. That doesn't mean the commercial banks will. I mean, I've seen it here in Australia, where a central bank may lower it by 0.25%, and the commercial bank will have that. They only lower it by 0.13. So if people think that the government's going to, or the banks are going to lower interest rates, I agree with Alistair. No, they're not. The commercial banks will want their pound of flesh, and they'll either keep it the same or they'll do half of what the central bank does. We're in a bit of a pickle. So to summarise, central banks, as we said, don't control the interest rates. The commercial banks do. So central bank may drop it 0.25%, but commercial banks will only drop it not at all or half that amount. Darryl, you've got something up?
Yeah, look, I do have a question for you. It revolves around Jamie Dimon. I was really interested that when I heard this. The CEO of JP Morgan, largest bank in the US, of course, is now reported as selling $1 million shares of his own, which is worth approximately $140 million. I'm interested to know your thoughts here. Why would he sell off 1 million shares if he really thought the market was strong and he believed the company's prospects were good moving forward? Just seems strange to me. I'm really interested in your comments.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good point. I can add to that. And according to the press reports I've seen, it's the first time he has sold any of his stock in JP Morgan. So why now? It's an extremely good question. I think there's only one answer. I mean, this guy, remember, and we discussed this at the time, what was about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, he said, the other day I said, this is at a banking conference in New York, by the way, in a speech he made. The other day I said that, well, 2 weeks ago, I said that I thought that we were facing an economic storm. I'm upgrading that to hurricane.
Yeah.
And he more or less hit the top of the bank credit cycle right on the nail. Yeah. Now, this is the most powerful commercial banker in the world. He didn't get there by being an idiot. He understands what's going on in the economy. And I think you're right to raise this because the fact that he is cashing out, I mean, okay, not a lot, but I mean, he's, 140, 150 million bucks, particularly if he puts it into gold, will keep him going forever. So, this guy is no idiot. I mean, the gold bugs hate him because JP Morgan conspires to suppress the gold price, whatever, silver price and so on. Yeah, okay. They are a government agent, but, if you're going to be the most powerful commercial banker in America, then you have to work with the authorities. Otherwise, you're not the most powerful banker in America. So actually, I mean, he has very successfully enhanced JP Morgan's profits, its role, if you like, its dominance in the US economy, and all the rest of it. So this guy really does know what he's doing. And if he says something, you listen. If he does something, note, which is precisely what you've done, Darryl. And you're absolutely right to raise that point. So to me, the message is very, very clear. It's very much in the category of upgrading it from a storm to a hurricane.
Exactly. And like we had a couple of clients come into our office a couple of days ago, and they'd been trusting their financial advisor and investing in all sorts of different stocks. But they told me that their stocks were valued at, or their portfolio, at $560,000 2 years ago. And they're bitterly disappointed now that their portfolio has a value of approximately half of that. And yet their financial advisor is saying, no, stay with it, everything's okay, which is what we've been hearing for some time now. But the interesting thing about all of that is that if they'd have been investing, or had they made a decision, and they brought this to my attention, had they been investing in gold 2 years ago, they'd sold their portfolio, right, and thrown everything into gold, they'd be up 30% today instead of being down 50%. That's the difference. Yeah, right. So no, I like your answer, and I thought that's what you would say, because he is one of the very, very smart guys in the world. I think he's got about I think his portfolio is worth, he's got about 8 million shares, something like that. It's massive. But to sell off any portion is telling us, like, cutting something, yeah.
He owes something that he's not.
That he's not sharing.
Not sharing. Yeah, exactly. Okay. I have a question after these facts. You know me. I spread down the list of items, and then I come up with the correct. So I've got here the facts. Number one, the Ukraine war is supported by the United States, right? So financially supported by the United States. Now we have an Israeli war supported by the United States. We have the US government interest payment is now, yeah, you're right, 980 billion. It's the last interest rate payment. So you could say $1 trillion. Now, $1 trillion, by the way, God, is 1,000 billion. Right? The US GDP growth, they tell about growth.
No, it's a million. It's a million.
A million. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's 1,000 billion. Yeah, exactly. The US GDP growth, which they talk about, is only coming from government expenditure, not coming from private enterprise. It's coming from government spending. The US financial assets are wildly overpriced. We've just discussed a part of that. But so why is gold completely mispriced? I mean, in Australia, we saw it reach $3,100 an ounce, or let's say, we'll talk US dollars. It went to, I think, 2006, about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. Stayed there for a couple of days, went back, now back under 1975. It's done that 3 times in the last 3 or so months. And it's so underpriced compared to the amount of currency that's printed. So I know you did say that it's not going to be long, and I'd like to know what your opinion is on the length of time that these guys are capable of still running this episode of $2,000 US per gold, which it should be, 2,500, 3,000. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first error is that you can't really look at the relationship between gold and a fiat currency in any quantitative sense, because the determination of the subjective value of the currency is entirely in the population's hands. So they wake up and they understand that it's the dollar going down, not gold going up. And from then on, the dollar's got a real problem. So far, everyone I talk to, even in the gold market, believes it's the price of gold that's rising or falling or whatever, not the dollar. They've got it completely the wrong way around. It's the sort of objective, subjective analysis, which is the objective value. The idea behind money is that is an objective value, because any variation in the prices of goods is this due to the subjective value that people put on the price of goods, on the value of a good or a service. The currency has got to be the stable thing. And we all assume that. I mean, if you go and buy something in a shop, the shopkeeper thinks that an Australian dollar is $1. That is the constant. But if they're going to sell something off the shelf, which is slow, they've got to lower the price of the thing off the shelf. So quite naturally, they think that all the subjectivity in terms of the price is actually in the goods, not in the currency. Now, as a separate issue, we know that over time, the purchasing power of the currency tends to decline. Why? Because you've got an irresponsible government. I mean, whatever. But from moment to moment, the value, if you like, of a fiat currency is entirely dependent on the faith in which people put in it. And so that objective-subjective relationship between gold and the currency is that gold is the objective value. That is not changing. The subjective value is the currency. That is the one that changes. That's the one that goes up, down. Normally the value goes down. I was actually looking at this for an article which will be released on Thursday for GoldMoney, and the dollar since 1971 has actually lost almost 99%. It's 98.2% of its value. In terms of if you like, in terms of real money, what legally is money and what historically has been money. And of course, you tell this to people. They know that we've had inflation and all the rest of it, and we know that the central banks have a target of 2% inflation, which basically means that the purchasing power of the dollar over time declines. Well, but nearly 99%. I mean, you must be joking. They don't actually realize what's been happening. So, I mean, that's, the way to look at this is not in the sense that there are so many dollars outstanding and there's only so much gold, let us say, in the central bank's reserves. Therefore, divide the number of dollars by the reserves in the central bank and you get a figure which should cover it. No, that's not the way to look at it at all. The relationship is this objective-subjective relationship between gold and a fiat currency. As to how long the current situation can continue, we see the debt trap. That's one issue. We see the central banks deeply in negative equity, which is something that can be fixed with the exception of the ECB. That's going to have a real trouble. So that's another issue. You've got commercial banks trying to reduce their exposure to the economy and things like commercial real estate and all the rest of it, and which could bankrupt this bank, that bank, whatever. That's another problem. You've got as energy prices are forced to rise by those nasty Russians and nasty Saudis and nasty Iranians, who may indeed close off the Straits of Hormuz, and close off the Red Sea if things cut up rough. But even without that, you're going to see, price inflation, headline CPI inflation rise. They'll try and fiddle the way out of it. They always do, but it'll still rise. And so interest rates will continue to rise at the central bank level. You just made the point about contracting bank credit. The shortage of credit means that the cost of credit will tend to rise. So that's basically taking out the whole of the private equity industry, which, we've got a very good example of that. Thames Water, which is, I think, our largest water utility in terms of households being served, is pretty much bankrupt. It'd been thrown a lifeline. But the reason for that is that, good old utility business, which is nice and stable and all the rest of it, to which we add that the regulator works out all the numbers and says, this is the profit you can have. So they're guaranteed a profit. It's quite simple. So what happened was that when interest rates were close to zero, private equity goes in, buys it, cost of funding, square root of sweet nothing. Now interest rates are rising. Whoops, we got a problem. Even they're going bust. Simple businesses which have been overloaded with debt due to what's been happening over the last 10 years, 15 years, they're going bust. So that's another one. What does government do? Government basically bails it all out. So that's a problem. And that's before we talk about the loss of influence that the king dollar has over the rest of the world, which is gradually being eroded by the mistakes that the American administration are making in their foreign policy. Trying to stop Russia, contain Russia, conquer Russia. Whatever the objective is immaterial, but the Ukraine is a disaster. I hear that there's a group of 50 countries which are supporting Ukraine, and a committee of these countries are now talking to Zelensky with a view to seeing to what extent a compromise with the Russians can be found, which will involve ceding territory to the Russians. Do you think that Putin's going to sit there and say, oh, yeah, we can agree? No, what he'll do, because his objective is completely different, and that is to just get the Americans out of Europe, get the Europeans on his side, which basically means chucking the Americans out and us if we continue to behave as we do, like the Russians' pet poodle, not the Russians, sorry, the America's pet poodle. So you can see that that what's going to happen? I mean, I think that America will just walk away from it, just as they did in Afghanistan. That's 2 walkaways in President Biden's first term. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
And the reason it's going to happen is because they've run out of ammunition. They've now got to concentrate all their efforts on the Israeli-Hamas situation. I mean, they can't fight 2 wars. They can't even fight 1 war. So you can see that, I mean, the loss of face as they walk away from the Ukraine will only be offset by, the fact that their priorities have changed for very obvious and sensible strategic reasons. We need to protect Israel from Hamas, Hezbollah, whatever, which if they get involved, I mean, God save us is all I can say. So you can see all these factors are all coming together. And they're also hidden factors. You've got the whole of the derivatives thing, which is a huge, great credit overhang over the whole banking system. And of that, if you look at the foreign exchange exposure in the form of exposure in non-American banks, in other words, outside the US credit system, then according to the Bank of International Settlements, we're looking at a further $90 trillion. That is the extent of the euro-dollar market, if you like. And there's another 10 trillion of bonds, euro-dollar bonds. I mean, we think that the euro-dollar bond market is the extent of it. No, it's not. The credit market is 9 times bigger. So all these factors, it's like sort of Hitchcock's The Birds. They're all gathering on top of the roof of the house of these people trapped in it. And we know what's going to happen. You don't go outside because you'll get pecked to death.
Yeah.
That's roughly where we are. How long it'll take, only time will tell. But you can see the whole thing gathering. And I think the other question, which we don't know the answer to, is we don't know when it'll start, but we also don't know how long it'll take. It could happen very, very quickly, because the point about this objective-subjective relationship, when people realize that actually it's not the dollar which is the objective in terms of pricing everything, it's subjective itself. When people realize that, then I think the dollar is toast, and the whole of the fiat currency system on top of it. And going back to the point that you were asking about earlier, Darryl, this is why the Singaporeans, Chinese, and the Russians have been accumulating gold like Billio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they know it's real money.
Yeah. Before you finish, Darryl, I just thought to make a note, especially for our viewers again. I've always, certainly in the last 5 years, probably dominated in the last 5 years, I've bought gold and silver relentlessly. And I would say that basically 80% of my wide wealth is in gold and silver. The other 20% is in some gold mining shares, and that takes a bit of time as well to understand them. But I also say that if you find something that is of really great value, sell your gold. So if that value of something is in fiat currency, sell your gold for fiat currency and go and buy it. But I'll guarantee you this, I haven't seen anything in the last 5 years that is worth more than having gold in my portfolio. And Egon von Braus has always said, how much do you buy? How much do you have? Whatever you can't afford to lose. And it's a great statement.
Yeah, well, I want to add to that a little bit. And just, both Brian and myself, Alasdair, have been going through a maintenance phase with both of our properties, and it seemed endless. I happen to live over the water, so that even encourages maintenance, of course. And I look at the expenditure on an ongoing basis, and I sat down the other day and I thought, I've always believed that gold has been undervalued and underestimated. Most people don't understand it at all. But I thought about it the other day and I thought, gold, last 3 years, up 750%. I mean, you could buy gold at $400 spot. And now we know it's at
$3,050 thereabouts. So it's up 750%. By the way, maintenance, that's over the last 20 years, 22 years. The last 5 years, some people say, oh, okay, 22 years is a long time to have you know, to be invested in anything. Well, that's fine, as long as you're getting a return on it, that's okay. But you look at the last 5 years, you know, gold's up $1,600 Aussie. So it's seriously significant. And so I look at this and I say, it doesn't get much better than that.
No.
Right?
Maintenance?
Maintenance factor. I mean, does anyone not own a feather duster? Because that's about all you need. On an annual basis, just give it a bit of a flick and that's it. And you think to yourself, how good does it get? Look, how do we educate people? What do we do, Alasdair, to educate people into having a greater understanding of the value of holding gold?
I think we just got to try and keep batting on and trying to make it as simple as possible to understand the difference between money and credit. And I think you could probably get people to understand that having money in the bank in the form of a deposit does impart some sort of risk because they will have talked to people in the past who had money stuck in a bank which went belly up, or they might have had a grandfather in that position back in the 30s, whatever. So that I think is what our education should really focus on, that there is this difference between money which you possess, physical coin or bars, gold or silver, but particularly gold. There's a difference between that, where there is no counterparty risk and counterparty risk. Where you might have a slightly more difficult problem convincing people is that you get Australian dollar notes, a wad of notes. That at least is more secure than the bank. But trying to persuade them or try to make them understand that that is not the same thing as money. It is still credit. It is credit issued by the central bank, and you have to have faith in that credit. It is only faith that gives it value. Otherwise, you could put it on a lavatory roll and just tear it off as you need it. I mean, so that is the difference, if you like, between toilet paper and currency. So go to Venezuela and ask them about it. So it's just pure faith, and that is something that can disappear. And if you sort of begin to understand that governments are becoming horribly indebted, they can't raise taxes anymore, or they can't raise them as fast as their expenses are rising, or whatever. I mean, there's obviously a degree of analysis that people have to do on their own government situation. And just sort of realize from there. I mean, your description about property and so on and so forth does ring a bell with me, because I did an analysis quite some time ago about property prices in London, which have absolutely soared. And when I adjusted the prices for to price them in gold, I found that property prices have risen by some 30%. And this is from about 1968. So we're talking about over a very long period of time. Obviously, that's not the whole story, because the point about property is that you can go along to a bank, you can, or a building society, you can borrow a mortgage, and you can leverage up that return. So, you can turn, say $10,000 40 years ago into $1 million today. So you do have that gearing effect, which is fantastic. But then there is the other aspect, and that is, how do you value this property in a collapsing credit market, if you like? Yeah. I mean, is it, in other words, do you hang on to your property, or do you sell it for gold? because we've now got the condition of where we're moving towards hyperinflation. Hyperinflation in the sense that the pace at which currencies are losing their purchasing power is accelerating. Now, the interesting thing is that what you have to look at is what do you get in terms of a yield on your property, in terms of rental. I'm not talking about your home. That's a utility, okay? We're talking about investing in property. So you buy a property in order to rent out to someone who wants to live in your in your property, and you've then got an income, and against that you've got the expense of maintaining it, because you obviously must maintain it. Now, what happens in an hyperinflation is that the value of your rental income doesn't change, because you've given the guy a lease for a year, for example.
Yes.
But the cost of maintaining it very rapidly begins to exceed the income. So. Yeah. When you've got a situation where the income is considerably less than the cost of obtaining it, which is really what we're talking about, then the property becomes completely valueless. And that is the relationship that you need to look at. If you're, let's say, trying to decide, well, I'm not worried about the situation because I've got property, it'll be all right. But you've got to, I'm sure after the collapse of the currency is gone and we've got a new regime and all the rest of it, fine, you may well be right. And when you look at the, if you look at, the sort of the really wealthy estates which have continued for a very long time, they go through bad times, good times and all the rest of it, but they come out of it and they're still together and so on. So I wouldn't dismiss that very, very long-term approach entirely, but there will be a time, I think, where, even if you can afford to maintain your properties at considerably greater expense than their rental income, then on that basis, you're going to lose capital value hugely, and you would be far better off in gold. So that, I think, is all I got to say about property. It's just an illustration, really, of gold's purchasing power remaining relatively constant through the centuries. I looked at Diocletian's edict, which I think was about 230 AD. So we're looking a long, long time ago. We're looking, 1,800 years, something like that. And a lot of those prices are very similar to those today, measured in gold. Which is fascinating. It just proves the point. It's the fiat currencies that come and go because they're credit, not real money, and that's why real money is real money, and it remains so, and even more so, given the events that we currently face.
Unbelievable. Yeah, spot on. Yeah, great comments once again. Always the case. Supporting you, Alasdair. Unfortunately, we're not out of time. We go forever. I don't know whether our viewing audience would feel the same way. I don't have a comment, right? Yeah. But no, once again, Alasdair, your contributions are fantastic, and your responses are always very educational. And we just walk out better people every time that we listen to Alasdair, don't we?
Oh, absolutely.
Just think smarter. It just makes you a smarter person. And I always refer to Charlie Jones because he had Alasdair in mind, I'm sure, when he talked about where you would be in 10 years' time. You'd be in exactly the same position you're in right now, apart from two things: the people you meet and the books you read. And Alasdair heading that list. I mean, whether you read a book or you listen and become educated listening to somebody, then take advantage of that. And my strong suggestion to any one of our subscribers, any one of our viewers watching this interview tonight, follow Alasdair Macleod, and just watch his interviews and educate yourself. You'll just come out a much smarter person.
Yeah, just stop watching The Days of Our Lives and listen to Alasdair Macleod.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we mentioned Jim Sinclair earlier. They said, but if not, Jim Sinclair said, just do what the central banks of the world do. Most of them, all of them own gold. Some just own a lot more than others. So, and if it's good enough for them,
why wouldn't it be good enough for us? Makes enormous sense. Thank you, Alasdair. Thank you so much for your support of this channel. Really appreciate it. And we'd also like to thank our viewers and subscribers for supporting us in the manner that they do. And so say until next time, all of us, and stay well and stay focused. Goodbye for now.